Hello, everyone, and welcome to this public event, which is the closing keynote to a symposium we have been holding this week on gender, peace, education, and international law. This event and the symposium are being held under the project titled Gendered Peace, which is funded by an ERC grant with Professor Christine Schinken and Dr. Louise Aramatsu as co-PIs. I am Dr. Sherry Lebensky. I'm a former research officer on the Gendered Peace Project and currently a lecturer in law at Goldsmiths, University of London. So to give you all a bit of context, this symposium was created in order to allow us to think about the relationship between gender, peace, and education, and how these relationships play out in international law, or indeed how these relationships and the nuance gained from their interactions are often sidelined by international law and international actors. This is despite the numerous references to both peace and education throughout core international legal instruments, and the growing references to gender within the work of the international legal system. International law's role in all of this was questioned, but this symposium didn't just look to law, it looked outside of it in order to better understand the realities and nuances of peace education that the law is often unable to capture. In this process, we centered feminist methods and their richness and their ability to break down some of the rigid constraints law imposes. This leads me to our talk here today, titled Gendering Peace Education, in between dialogue, difference, and dissidence, where our keynote speaker will question, in her words, how does an intersectional lens push us to think differently about both what is labeled as gender and peace education, and also what is not labeled as gender and peace education. And she will do this through looking at silenced and marginalized histories and methods. So let me properly introduce our keynote speaker. I'm extremely excited to welcome Shweta Singh, who is Senior Assistant Professor of International Relations at the South Asian University in New Delhi, India. Her research broadly focuses on the politics of everyday, norms, and the WPS agenda, critical peace and conflict studies, with a particular focus on post-colonial South Asia, gender and populism, and contemporary politics of Afghanistan, Kashmir, and Sri Lanka. She has been the recipient of the prestigious United States Leadership Award in 2010 and the Mahbub al-Haq Award in 2013. She was recently appointed as the UN Women International Expert on Populism, Nationalism, and Gender for the Regional Office for Asia and Pacific. Shweta, I'm so thrilled to have you here today. Now, before we begin, I have some admin information to note. This event, as you will see, is being recorded. The kind of structure of the event is that shortly I'll invite Shweta to give her talk, which will last approximately 30 minutes. I will then open up the discussion to the audience. So if you want to ask a question or post a comment, or please post this in the chat box. Okay, so that's it from me. Shweta, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. Thank you, LSC and the WPS Center. And so I've been thinking about, these ideas on gendering peace education, and I thought, where do I begin my story today from? I thought I would draw in on two narratives, and let me read out the two narratives to you. As we walk through gendering peace education today. O learned Pandits, wind up the selfish prattle of your hollow wisdom and listen to what I have to say. This is Mukta Salve writing about the grief of Meher and Mangs in 1855. The second narrative that I want to draw your attention is, I call, you are stone. One day you look and find I'm gone. Rahila Muska, as quoted in Elissa Griswold. The first narrative that I said is of Mukta Salve, who belonged to the Mang or Matang community, which was considered to be one of the lowest and ritually impure communities within caste hierarchies in colonial India. Her narrative that I draw on is the translation of her original work, which was written in the Marathi language. I underline in the Marathi language in the year 1855. The work is titled Mang Maharanchya Dukh Vishishta, the translation of which reads as about the grief of Mahar and the Mang. She had no access to education until 1852, when Jyoti Rao Phule and Savitri Bai Phule started their third girls' school at Vettalpet in Pune. Girls like Mukta, who belonged to the untouchable caste, were denied a voice in the system of education and learning that perpetuated and legitimized structures of oppression like patriarchy and caste based discrimination in colonial India. The second narrative is a folk couplet called Lande, an oral and often anonymous song sung by Pashtun women in Afghanistan, who have used this oral tradition to articulate truth about war, violence, separation, homeland, and grief. The teenage poet who sung this called herself Rahila Muska. Eliza Griswold, who worked on the Landes project, writes, Rahila Muska lived in Helmand, a Taliban stronghold. Muska, like many young and rural Afghan women whom I'm thinking about right now, was not allowed to leave home, and poetry was her only form of education, and perhaps her only form of resistance. In 2010, Muska set herself on fire as her brothers had discovered that she wrote poetry and was badly beaten up for the same before she set herself on fire. Muska's lived experience underline how women experience war, militarism, and militarization differently given their social situatedness in a highly patriarchal and misogynist culture in Afghanistan. Why do I bring these two narratives to you here today? These two narratives, while situated in two different periods, one from the period of colonial India, putting forth the experiences of a Dalit woman, and the other drawn more recently from the experiences of a Pashtun woman in Afghanistan, are bound by the voices of difference and dissidence. My purpose here is not to bring to you these narratives in a linear, simplistic template of how women were oppressed or stand oppressed in South Asia. But my purpose is to locate the political in these stories of difference, dissidence, and resistance. The pertinent point that I would like to make right at the outset is that the universal one size fits template of peace education, as scripted in the global north, do not essentially reflect the world and consciousness of women like Mukta Salve, located in colonial India, or Muska, located in Afghanistan. As Gayatri Spivak would say, their world and consciousness is mediated by experiences of coloniality and post-coloniality, complicated by the intersecting identities of class, caste, region, religion. Thus, when I talk about gendering peace education, I want to particularly pay attention to what Chandra Talpade Mohanty calls politicization of experience. As I travel with you today through the complex maze of feminist histories, I want to underline the histories are not in singular, but in the plural in South Asia. In attempting to trace an alternative feminist genealogy of peace education, I am curious and I want to push you to understand the alternative sites of knowledge production. And in the process, my attempt is to visibilize what has been invisibilized given the politics of language, location, representation, and representability. Many of the texts, stories, and narratives that constitute complex feminist histories in the region and from which I draw from today, on which I draw on today, are not essentially written in the English language. And yet, I argue, they do not need to be relegated to the margins or pushed aside as just local women writing on violence, peace, or education. These narratives that exemplify the everyday lived experiences of women are political. These women do not necessarily speak or recognize the language of what is classified as peace education today. But they definitely put forth an alternative agenda for peace education that pays attention to differing temporality of struggles, or what Talpade calls politicization of experience. I have to say that as I attempt to navigate this complex maze of feminist histories marked by oral traditions, letters, autobiographies, short stories through different periods in history, I'm struck both by the complexity of this task and its daunting nature. Further, there is the difficult call of navigating epistemic traps in between disciplinary dictates that in more than one way constrains me to label or not label what is classified as peace education. So today, as I speak here on this forum, I pay attention to what is labeled as gender and peace education, and more importantly, what is not labeled as gender and peace education, which is mostly the case with the writings of feminist scholars from the global south. I want to underline that the field is marked by epistemic silences, erasures, and marginalization, not just about the field, but also within the field. So as I problematize this genealogy of peace education, I want that marginalizes the specific historicity of the region and lays epistemic traps that pays inadequate attention to local histories. And in the process, as I said, marginalizes key questions around politics of representation, language, location, and politics of knowledge production. Gayatri Spivak, and I draw from her, very rightly says, the problem of human discourse is generally seen as articulating itself in the play of three shifting concepts: language, world, and consciousness. Keeping in mind the politics of language, I argue that gender perspectives on education for peace that evolved in the global south were different, given that they were scripted in an alternative vocabulary. They reflected a world and consciousness that did not use the language of peace education as construed in the global north. And thus, the field is marked both by dialogue, difference, and dissidence. I do take recourse to Mikhail Bakhtin's writing, and to my mind, Bakhtin's writings find resonance in terms of feminist thinking. And this is important in the context of the politics of language. Bakhtin argues and stresses the crucial importance of language for politics and privileges language as a creative force to be read not by one-size-fit conceptual templates that are located in the global north. The feminist task is to be able to read through the discursive imaginaries of an alternative understanding of violence and peace in the writings of these women that I bring to you today. Recognizing that language can be both a hegemonic as well as a creative force. It is important to understand how many of the significant work of feminists in the global south have received inadequate attention precisely because issues of translation, visibility, and politics of knowledge production. Today, I consciously choose to walk you through feminist histories and subaltern traditions, drawing on work originally written in languages other than English. So for instance, I would first talk about the Therigatha. Now, the Therigatha is an anthology of poems by and about the first Buddhist woman. The text dates to as early as the 6th century. The second text, which I'll draw your attention, is a short story written by Rokhaya Sakawat Hussain, which is called The Sultana's Dream, located in 1905. And then I would just draw briefly on the writings of Savitribai Phule, which was written in the Marathi language. So, as I said, my first stop is the Therigatha. Now, Therigatha is fascinating to my mind. Therigatha is an anthology of 73 poems found in Pali canon, composed by Theris or elder women. The gathas or songs impart significant details of early Buddhist life. But the critical question for me when I read the Theri is, what does it mean to be a Theri, a Buddhist monk writing in the 3rd and the 6th century? And what insights do these Theris bring to us through their writing on grief, sorrow, and everyday violence that is documented in the gathas or songs? Why do I choose the Therigatha? Why do I bring the Therigatha to this forum when I'm talking about gendering and peace education? The reasons are twofold. First, these are some of the earliest writings of women in ancient India. Second, these poems, while might not present feminist vocabulary in line with Western templates of feminist theory, yet they bring to fore key insights from the standpoint of voice, agency, and intersectionality. all of which are pertinent to understand an alternative agenda for peace education. Hannah Arendt very rightly says, freedom is to call something into being which did not exist before, which was not given, not even as an object of cognition or imagination. And the attempt is to locate early feminist vocabulary through the readings of everyday experiences of Terry's, as put forth in the Terigata. In the process, I argue that oral histories, textual traditions, canonical texts in different periods of Indian history can be alternative generative sites for knowledge production with global ramification. Feminist scholars like Kumari Jayawardena called for an ideological revolt and a break from the older order in the spirit of dialectics rooted in the indigenous philosophical systems. And here I make an attempt, a conscious attempt, to bring to light some of these philosophical traditions underlining the spirit of dialogue, dissidence, and difference. So, for instance, going back to Terigata, when you look at the patterns of grief, sorrow, and everyday violence that is documented in these gathas, I would say what feminists classify as continuum of violence, to my mind, goes back to this ancient Indian text. I'm not in any way making a deductive or reductionist argument here. All I am saying is that we need to look at sites which conventionally we would not accord legitimacy to. This is intricately connected to politics of knowledge production and epistemic marginalization of women's voices, both in the writing of history and, for me, in the writing of the discipline of IR. I want to draw on three different verses from the Terigata to walk you through some of the ideas that I just spoke about. For instance, the verse of the Rohini poem highlight how these women came from different regions. They were a diverse group of women who were drawn from different paths. Yet they presented an idea of community and cooperation that exemplify feminist ethics of power and care. I quote, "Those who have gone forth are from various families and from various regions, and still they are friendly with each other. That is the reason why aesthetics are dear to me." The feminist ethics of power and care resonates with the idea of power put forth much later by feminist thinkers like Hannah Arendt. Further, the voice of Mutta, another theory that I draw on, is pertinent to understand agency within patriarchal modes of household. And I quote again, this is the voice of Mutta. "The name I am called by means freed. Am I quite free? Well, free from three crooked things: mortar, pestle, and husband with his own crooked thing. I am freed from birth and death, and what leads to rebirth has been rooted out." It is pertinent to point that while these verses were written against the backdrop of Buddhist practice, the text cannot be read in a singular frame or agency. For instance, the socio-political milieu, the subtle idea of agency from the standpoint of the individual, is something which is very pertinent to underline. There's the other verse that I want to draw on. This is about a verse spoken to Tissa by the Buddha. Trissa, train yourself strictly. Don't let what can hold you back overwhelm you. When you are free from everything that holds you back, you can live in the world without the depravities that ooze out from within. You can see the subtext of emancipatory politics seeping in these writings. Borrowing from Sumi Madhok, we need more nuanced conceptual filters, or what she calls conceptual interventions, that are located in the historicity of the region and representing local specificities, and more importantly, embedded in the temporality of struggles. More importantly, what I do say is look beyond the West. But when you do that, do not carry the filters of conceptual interventions that are located in the West itself. Foreground a more local vocabulary with global ramifications. Let me shift my gaze to colonial India now. But before I do that, I want to acknowledge that there are many authors who are writing in the regional languages, for instance, in the period from 6th century onwards. And there's a very interesting work that I want to draw your attention to, Susie Tharu and K. Lalita, who have put forth a compilation of women's writing in India 600 BC onwards, and what can be classified as subaltern tradition, subaltern oral tradition, cutting across 13 different languages. For instance, Bengali, Gujarati, Kannada, Malayalam. The core point being decenter the English language and look beyond, in the context of this, look beyond the core philosophical texts when you're trying to look for an alternative imagination of peace. So the second text that I said right at the beginning that I want to draw your attention is to a short story. Now, this short story was written by Ruqayya Sakhawat Hossain, and the title of the story is Sultana's Dream. Now, Sultana's Dream is very interesting because Sultana's Dream, in fact, is one of the earliest science fiction stories written by a woman. Just very briefly, we need to locate how Ruqayya, through this piece of feminist writing, discursively constructs an alternative imaginary to war and militarism through recourse to what can now be classified as feminist science. It is important to situate the writer, Ruqayya Sakhawat Hossain, to understand the temporality and patterns of her struggle. She was a Bengali Muslim woman who grew up in a colonial province. Her differing identities signify her politics of resistance. In what can be classified as discursive construction of an alternative universe, Ruqayya, through the portrayal of Sultana, offers, Sultana is the central character in that story, offers a scathing but witty critique of both militarism and patriarchy. She talks about a feminist science hinged on education. Hossain's story reveals itself as anti-military. She puts forth out the ideas of ecofeminism much before the idea of ecofeminism was actually institutionalized in the vocabulary that we are talking about. Hossain also launched Anjuman-e-Khwateen-e-Islam, Islamic Women's Association. We need to go back to such networks to look at the kind of resources they offer to us when we are trying to understand this alternative genealogy of gender and peace education. As I said right at the beginning, when I was writing this lecture, for me, the idea that was very significant was the idea of difference, articulated in the many voices of women across history in South Asia. And so, and obviously, I do not claim to capture it in its entirety at this point of time. But as I walk through this maze, this very complex maze of feminist histories, I want to now draw your attention and do the work of Savitribai Phule. And Savitribai Phule, to my mind, is pertinent when we are thinking about critical pedagogy. And so let me just give you a brief backdrop. Savitribai Phule, along with her husband, Jyotirao Govindrao Phule, both prominent Dalit social reformers of the 19th century, set up the first school for underprivileged girls in 1848. And please remember, Mukta Salve, whose narrative that I bring to you, she, at the age of 14, for the first time could go to school in Savitribai Phule's school. So that was the first time she had access to education. The Phules belonged to the Dalit community in Maharashtra and had experienced caste violence and marginalization, including the denial of education. They set up the school in times when education for women, particularly for those belonging to untouchable castes, the Dalits, was not even included, let alone prioritized in the nationalist discourse on education. Why am I talking about Phule when I'm talking about gendering and peace education? To my mind, Savitribai Phule is the voice of critical feminist pedagogy located in India. Sharmila Rege, who's done extensive work on Savitribai Phule, outlines the significance of education for emancipatory politics. And I think the idea of emancipatory politics is central to the idea of gendering peace education in the region. And when we talk about the idea of emancipatory politics through the frames of education, drawing on the writings of Savitribai Phule, I want to take you all to this concept of Tritiya Ratna. Tritiya Ratna. What is this idea of Tritiya Ratna? And what significance does it have for us when we are looking at the scripting of a vocabulary? Tritiya Ratna is driven by the utopia of educate, organize, and agitate. Tritiya Ratna recast the relationship between power and knowledge from the perspective of the oppressed. And I want to underline here, and this was in the context of the Dalit community that we're talking about. And the aim was to interrogate the social world constituted by dominant practices which were both exclusionary and oppressive. Jyotirao Phule and Ambedkar, who were also writing in the same time, in several writings and speeches, but more particularly, for instance, in the Gulamgiri and the Annihilation of Caste, problematized the nationalist discourse, which focused on India as a Hindu Brahminical civilization. They argued that the nationalist discourse excluded the voices of those who were on the margins of caste hierarchies, like the Dalits. This hegemonizing discourse was also embedded in the content and practice of the then educational system, which prioritized dominant cultures centered around Brahminical practices. Phule and Ambedkar, in different times and contexts, argued that education system was both exclusionary and oppressive, and thus pushed for an alternative pedagogical perspective. It is in this context that Savitribai Phule's work is particularly significant, as it articulated how patriarchy and caste was linked, and I want to underline that, and how educational spaces play a role in perpetuating structural violence, or what many feminist scholars like Uma Chakravarti call Brahminical patriarchy in the context of India. Savitribai Phule paid attention to the intersecting axes of difference and oppression in colonial India and called for a focused understanding of the politicization of experiences of Dalit women through the education system. By doing so, Phule articulated a powerful alternative vocabulary of violence, gender, and education. Phule also made substantive contributions to critical feminist pedagogy as the first woman activist in India who recognized how educational spaces and teaching learning processes can build critical spaces for resistance. I want to saunter a bit away from India to Nepal. And the example that I take from Nepal is of Chandrakanta Devi Mala. Now, Chandrakanti Devi Mala, her name, her work, just very recently came to light, and through the Nepal Oral History Project. She was known as the first Guru Ma of Nepal, and she again, at the same time as Savitribai Phule, established a school in the 1930s in the Makhantole region in Nepal. Now, it's interesting because here class plays an important role. In the context of Savitribai Phule, we're talking about caste. Here, I bring in the idea of class. Now, Mala managed against all odds to convince the despotic Rana government to let her open a girls' school in the Makhantole. The stories of women like Mala are mostly part of oral history traditions and were recently brought to light by the Nepal Feminist Memory Project put together by Devas and Nayantara. Women like her and Savitribai Phule recognized intersectional axes of violence like caste and class long before the term intersectionality was coined. Further, they drew attention to complex issues of power, representation, and voice through the articulation of curriculum and pedagogy that highlighted how women were doubly subjugated, given the colonial experiences and the social situatedness in terms of caste, class, and region. It is significant to highlight that feminist perspectives on critical pedagogy from the global south articulated education as the practice of freedom and transformative change much before the field found resonance in the writings of scholars like Paulo Freire. For instance, early feminists like Phule and Mala highlighted how the lived experiences of women are different given their intersecting identities. It's this idea of difference in this critical pedagogical perspective that is something which is specifically important for us to take note of. As I draw this conversation to an end or bring it towards an end, I just want to make 3 crisp points. First, there is a need to problematize a one-size-fit template of peace education that and highlight how global South feminist writings and activism are premised on an alternative vocabulary of violence, peace, and education, rooted in the history of colonial and post-colonial struggles. Secondly, there is a need to highlight the limitations of a universal language of peace, education, and gender that does not pay adequate attention to issues of difference in relation to power. Third, and this is, I think, very important, education for feminist scholars in the global south is a critical site for politicization of experience, which essentially hinges on the values of liberation and resistance, and which global south feminists would argue are fundamental to the normative conceptualization of peace. Thank you very much.
Oh, that was phenomenal. And I have pages and pages of notes, and I don't want to take away time from anyone else, but I did want to kind of start us off on maybe a conversation, and then maybe more people will post in the chat and ask questions and kind of contribute. But I did want to kind of my first, and maybe this is slightly selfish, but thinking about everything that you just said, and how do you integrate this then as a teacher? How do you integrate this in the classroom? So we've been thinking about this in the symposium, how from an international law perspective, and when you're coming to teach the material, you might be constrained, it might be university constraints, it might be constraints within your discipline of actually bringing forth these, as you said, silenced histories, silenced traditions, and offering an alternative vocabulary, which can be quite difficult in a discipline that has kind of a set vocabulary of how to express ideas and how to contribute to the field. And so I just wondered, from a teaching point, how do you bring this work into the way you teach?
Thank you, Sherry. That's a tough question. I think for me, it is a tough question, because when you do not have universal templates, how do you actually talk about the specificities? And to my short answer to that would be, give space for students to bring their own lived experiences to the classroom context. And I think that's the difference. And it's very interesting. Before joining the South Asian University, I was teaching at Delhi University. And now I'm at the South Asian University. To my mind, the South Asian University classroom context is a very interesting classroom context, because it draws in from students from across South Asia. So for instance, if I'm talking about violence in South Asia, I cannot exclude the experiences of my students from Afghanistan or from Kashmir or from different conflict zones. And I think there has to be a space for elicitive teaching learning process. So I think something that I would draw in on is move away from the container approach, talk about elicitive teaching learning process with a space to politicize experience. And I think that's something which is very, very important if you're talking about critical pedagogy. So I'm not sure if I answered that question, but yes.
No, I think this resonates with a lot of the conversations we've been having about alternative methodologies and different ways of assessing students. So, not necessarily requiring students to write down an essay, but actually giving them the creative license to create a poem or to express how they understand peace or how they understand law and peace in a different way. So I think that, yes, you did answer my question.
Yes, and also, Sherry, most importantly, I would say, before I even go on to talk about peace, to my mind, how do they understand war and violence? Because I think the conversation, the starting point is the idea of violence. How do we actually understand violence? Mm-hmm. So there's this whole thing about, are we looking at peace really as a problem solving, like a universalistic model, and put the conversations around violence on the margin? But I think, to my mind, the starting point is violence and war. So yes.
And so then I'm just going to check the chat to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Okay, so then my question is, so then thinking about kind of the great metaphor you used that I really liked was filters. You said that yes, we need to look to other places, but we can't have this filter. And I know that I don't know, for some reason, maybe it's with social media and the filters and how we kind of distorted seeing of things, but it's that filter that, like you said, prevents us from seeing the different politics, the different languages, the different knowledge, and the different histories. And so it's not necessarily enough to look to these other places and to say, oh, I'm going to bring in these different alternatives if your filter is completely closed off to the actuality maybe of what you're looking at. Right. And so if you do, any point you want to come in and just kind of, but yeah, so I was just, thinking about the filter and how that actually, that kind of comes into law, and you do work on the WPS agenda. And I wonder kind of what your thoughts are around all this richness and nuance that's kind of filtered out really when the WPS agenda tries to kind of manage conflict and peace, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, I have to say that, when I think about filters, it's where you're coming in from, your own positionality, where are you located? And I think that goes so much in terms of framing your filters. And most of the time, for instance, if you're looking at the vocabulary of violence, and I keep going back to this, we have this template in our head in terms of how do I define violence? Where am I going to locate these ideas on violence? And I think, to my mind, that's why Sumi Madhok's work on conceptual interventions is so important. When she says, don't look at the global south through conceptual interventions located in the global north. Try moving away from these universalistic templates. And I think that's where the idea of filters coming in. So I think when I'm looking at a particular site, there is always my own positionality that mediates my viewing, my gaze. And I think that's important. And that's something which is very, very pertinent, even in the context of the WPS agenda. And because you're talking about this, I think it's important. For instance, I particularly have been interested and I've been curious to locate the political in the everyday. Most of the time, when we are talking about the WPS agenda, we are located at the I, at the international. We are located in the whole context of this normative framework, which works through norms diffusion, but we do not go down to understanding how does the idea of everyday actually impinge, for instance, in the context of translation of this global normative framework. So to my mind, when you're talking about the richness, I think the richness is located in the everyday, Sherry. And I think the number of examples that I tried getting in, the number of narratives that I tried getting in was through the narratives or the lived experiences, the everyday lived experiences of ordinary women. And I think the challenge is to locate the political in the ordinariness of the everyday. So Rob Walker would say, what do we recognize as political? That's in fact so important. Do we actually recognize this as political? The politics of what is political. So I think that's where one would go in. Yes. So yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we have quite a few questions that have come in on the chat. I don't know if you can see the chat, just so that you also have them in front of you, but I will read them out for those who don't have the chat in front of them. So the first one comes in from Cornelia Weiss, and she asks, would you be willing to address the contributions of Poolan Devi and Krishna Bose to the creation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325?
I'm really not sure about Poolan Devi, but something that I can definitely talk about in a tangential way is I do think we need to problematize this idea of looking at just only women in terms of the peace building contribution, problematize the binaries that we're talking about, look at the notion of masculinity that is embedded and the whole context of militarism that is embedded and that is actually taken forward by many women that we are talking about. So that's what I'll briefly say on that. But if I'm talking about the UNHCR 1325, which definitely is not the focus, I think we need to go back to the many civil society networks and their agency in the global south and their contribution. And there is a plethora of civil society networks. And that's why I think we need to look at the agency that rests within these civil society networks that we are talking about.
Okay, thank you. So there's a lot of comments in the chat that you might see about wonderful compliments about your talk. And then there's another one from Gina Heathcote. Professor Gina Heathcote says, thank you for this rich talk. There is a wonderful review of Sultana's Dream in the Feminist Review issue for those unfamiliar. And then she says, can you speak to some of the tensions in the piece, in this piece? For example, the gender switch where men are domestic workers and women hold power, which can be uncomfortable to think through. And how do we read that today?
So on the first question, some of the ideas that I'm talking about today has been published in the Feminist Research Handbook, the chapter that I write on gender in peace education. And obviously I build on some of the ideas there. Going back to Sultana's dream, it's a feminist utopia. And I think and there are definitely tensions, even on the idea of Sultana, like how she describes the portrayal of the character of Sultana. This whole thing about domesticity being relegated to the men and the idea of domesticity. So there are definite tensions, but we also need to understand where is this located. And I think that's something which is very important. When we are reading these stories or these autobiographical texts or texts, we need to locate the points in which they're being written. And I think I agree with some of the feminist scholars who say, you need to go beyond the discursive imagination and to read the subtext. Remember, this woman who was writing, a Bengali Muslim woman, did not even have access to education until she was allowed much later. And then she started writing both in Bengali and she was trained in English also. So there are tensions, and I would problematize an essentialist interpretation of many of these texts. But besides the tension, taking cognizance of the tension, there are ideas, there are discursive imaginations that we need to take note of. And I don't think I would be comfortable in relegating them on the margins on that count.
Great, thank you. And so another question's come in from Dr. Sarah Smith. She says, thank you for the brilliant lecture. I wondered if you could speak more to, if time permits, teaching and acknowledging resistance in peace education and the tensions in what is framed as peaceful and what is not.
Yes, I think this is a very interesting question. Acknowledging resistance in peace education, and I'm just thinking that this is the dilemma we all face in the classroom context. So, for instance, how would I talk about the idea of violence to my students from Kashmir sitting in New Delhi? There are tensions in that context. There is a tension that we are talking about, and the pedagogical practice itself, for instance, would be, I would say, constrained by those tensions. But what I, over the years, have developed is what I call dialogical engagement. I think it's important, and that's something that I would say, it's important to give that space within the designing of the curriculum, as well as the practice component in classrooms. So for instance, I teach a course on conflict transformation and peace building. And one of the things that I would really say in that course is, I don't think I have all the resources to offer because my students are the resources. I think I'm very privileged to be located in the South Asian University because the kind of learnings, the kind of experiences that students from all over South Asia bring to us in the classroom context, it is truly dialogical. At the same time, I think there has to be space. I think as a facilitator, I recognize there has to be space for resistance. And that, to my mind, goes through a dialectic process, really through a dialectic process. Creative pedagogy, looking at, for instance, alternative mechanisms, like, I could talk about music or theater. And that gives, for instance, in the pedagogical framework, spaces to articulate politics of resistance. But this is a difficult question, especially if you're located in zones, in classroom contexts, which are not homogeneous. And there are difficult questions that really come in at that time.
Thank you. So another question has come in from Amber Yadev. You spoke of text recording perspectives from early Buddhist women. Is there anything you can recommend for those who might want to learn more about their lives and ideas?
I would definitely talk about the Therigatha and the English translation of the Therigatha. That's something which is highly recommended. And read the Therigatha and look at the interpretations of Therigatha. But don't read it as a text, as a Buddhist text or as a religious text. Read it as a text written by women, mediating the experiences of Buddhism through their everyday lives. It's interesting, if you read the Therigatha, and the translation is easily available, if you read the Therigatha, questions on power, questions on sexuality, questions on body, these are a very diverse group of women who were writing the Gathas. So, there are these ordinary women, housewives, if I can use the word, or women who were prostitutes, older women. So, the whole idea of this intersecting identities in this diverse group of women, and they talking about their everyday experiences, and how, if we look at those everyday experiences, what are the patterns of violence, what are the patterns in the context of an alternative imaginary of peace that they're talking about. So I highly recommend the Terigata, something which is very under researched, very, very under researched. And I don't think we dig into the Terigata when we are talking about, for instance, a genealogy of peace education, or writing about a genealogy of peace education.
Great, thank you. And I will, I think I will jump back in. If there's more questions, please put them in the chat box. But so it was just something that you said during your lecture about educational systems and how they can, they can be this space for this type of transformation, but they can also perpetuate really harmful ideas. And I was just thinking how that does, I mean, it can be the case with language, it can be the case with art. I mean, so we've been in the symposium talking about how art can be this way to express, but art can also constrain. And in the keynote on Monday, Professor Otto talked about the art, the kind of stained glass windows in the ICJ, and how it's telling a very specific story. I mean, it's this beautiful thing to look at, but actually when you get close, it's this kind of concerning understanding of history. And so how these spaces can be on both sides of the binary, helping on one hand, the educational system can be this place of freeing, but also this place of constraint. And I just wondered if you could talk about the kind of just this idea that education can be this point, but it can also be this problem.
Yeah. I think, Shari, that's such a relevant question, especially in the times of populism and right-wing populism, if you're looking at how are curriculums being designed. Are curriculums really reflecting of the dominant ideology of the state? What is the kind of majoritarianism that seeps into curriculum designs? So for instance, if the curriculums are plagued by an ideological color, obviously they stifle space for resistance. So for instance, in colonial India, when I took you back to the work of Savitribai Phule, and I was talking about the idea of critical pedagogy, within the nationalist discourse, there was very little space to talk about the oppression of the Dalit women or women of the oppressed class. And obviously the dominant frame in the educational system at that point of time was very Brahminical. So how do you critique that? And how do you actually build alternative spaces? Coming back to contemporary times, if you're looking at curriculums right now, so for instance, if I can talk about the teaching of history in the subcontinent, how is history, for instance, taught in India, in Pakistan, and in Bangladesh? It'll be very interesting, for instance, if you pick up the 1971 as an event, and look at how that is being written about in history textbooks in Pakistan or in India or in Bangladesh, and you would look at the differing frames. What I'm trying to say is it's important to recognize that while education is a critical site for transformative change, and can be a critical site for transformative change, education can also become a tool to perpetuate a majoritarian ideology, which can definitely be stifling and which defeats the purpose of emancipatory politics. And this is something that we really need to take cognizance of when we are talking about educational systems, for instance, in the conflict zones. So, for instance, you're talking about language politics. If you go back to, for instance, curriculums in Sri Lanka, the whole predominance, for instance, of Sinhala language, and what was the politics to do? If you look at it historically, what was the politics of the Sinhala Only Act, and how would you look at the marginalization of Tamil as a language? How does it impact the framing of writing of history and curriculum designs? Obviously, then when you're looking at designing peace education curriculums, is there space then to talk about, for instance, ideas of reconciliation, which go back in terms of memory politics? There's this very interesting poem that comes to my mind from my fieldwork in Kashmir, and if I can say it, I'll translate that for you. It says, "Hum dard, wo dard ki shiddat badhate hain aur hum yaddash ki. While they increase the intensity of pain, we actually increase the intensity of remembering. And I think the politics of memory is such an important idea when we are thinking about, educational spaces. How do we remember? What do we choose to forget? How do we give that space for politics of remembering? So I think very scattered set of ideas, Sherry, to your question, but just wanted to jump in.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. It's then, now what you just said about histories, and I'm just thinking about the kind of feminists have problematized this idea of history within international law, how this very limited understanding of history gets pushed into international law. That's what we base the sources of international law on, and then therefore everything else is kind of following along in this suit. And these alternative voices, they don't get a look in, really. And then thinking about the discipline, I mean, so within your discipline of IR, I mean, how do you feel that way? I mean, I'm guessing, yes, you feel that way as well. But how then is it through our scholarship that we can kind of try to bring into these alternative voices? Is it through that problematization? Is it through the teaching? How do we break in to change that narrative really about this limited history?
That's a tough question, Sherry. I've been talking about disciplinary dictates within the discipline of IR in the region. And that's why I say that, when we talk about silences, when we talk about marginalization, they're not just, on the field, but from within the field. So for instance, if I'm talking about, feminist IR in South Asia, there's no singular feminist IR. I cannot talk about, a singular feminist IR. So obviously, when you're talking about spaces, there is this whole thing about, again, what should I say? The politics of erasures. What is political in your writing? How do you identify what is political? What are the disciplinary boundaries? And I think, right, when I was talking today, this is exactly what I said. Even in the politics of labeling what is recognized as peace education and what is not recognized as peace education, you're so bound by these disciplinary dictates. This is what classified, because this is not a conceptual filter that fits in. So how do you actually navigate your way? And I think the long and short answer to this, it's a continuing dilemma. I don't really have an answer to this, but networks, transnational networks, transboundary networks, feminist solidarities, and I think that plays a huge role in terms of what should I say? That plays a very important role when we are trying to look at the politics of knowledge production. So, for instance, I do want to talk about Kamla Bhasin, someone who's no more with us, but Kamla Bhasin, who was a feminist activist scholar, she worked in the context of building bridges between India and Pakistan. Now, people like Kamla Bhasin, people like Rubina Sehgal, who we again lost this year, feminist activists from the region who were scripting an alternative vocabulary of both the political, of war, of violence, and of peace. So, the challenge, Sherry, is again, how do you integrate that into your curriculum? How do you integrate that into your teaching learning process? And I think that can only be done when we are really looking at a pedagogical toolkit which is elicitive. And there are so many times that one is introduced to different kinds of resources from students who come from different parts of the world or the region. And I think that's so important to recognize. That's so important to recognize.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. If there is no other questions, I do want to just take a few minutes before we close just to say some thank yous, actually. So I wanted to say thank you so much to you, Shweta. This was a absolutely brilliant conclusion to our symposium. You've pulled through so many key themes that we've been discussing, and you've called on us to ask a lot more questions of ourselves and of our disciplines. So really, thank you so much. And I wanted to say thank you to the audience for your interventions and for attending. And I just want to have a big thank you to all of the participants and the chairs of the symposium for giving your time and for sharing your work with us. And also a thank you to Professor Christine Chinkin and Dr. Umatsu for, amongst many other things, for giving me the space to think about peace education and supporting my work in this way. And last but not least, a thank you to Dr. Sarah Smith for all your behind the scenes work. And thank you just everyone who's made this symposium possible. And the last thing I will say is, in case you missed Monday's event, you can find the recording on Facebook. And and then there is another Women, Peace and Security Center event, which is on the 9th of November at 1 o'clock and is called Putting Peace Back into Politics. So I will just end there, and thank you again, Shweta, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you, everyone. Thank you.